So yesterday we were talking about blood, yes? We were talking about the prohibition that the Torah has against eating blood, and the fact that the Torah specifically says, chazak, you should be strong when it comes to the prohibition against blood. And we saw that there were two views about that. There was the view of Rabbi Yehuda, who says you have to read this absolutely literally, and basically what it means is that there was a time in history, including when the Jews were in the desert, where blood was something that they were quite involved in, quite steeped in. And that's why they had to be told, be strong, to be able to rein themselves in and not eat blood. Then you had the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, who says, no, they're not at all. It's quite unnatural, actually, for a person to want to eat blood. And what the Torah wants to teach us over here is that if a so-called minor mitzvah requires that level of dedication, then you can be sure that a major mitzvah requires a lot more dedication. And so we said that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon ben Azai have two different views on how you're supposed to, what's the primary element that you're supposed to focus on when you interpret a pasuk. Rabbi Yehuda takes the view that the primary is the literal meaning of the words, and Rabbi Shimon ben Azai takes the view that the primary focus is how do we encourage people and create enthusiasm for their dedication to Judaism. So everything that we learn about is, on the one hand, practical, and on the other hand, spiritual. And they go hand in hand. So when we talk about not eating blood, there has to be a spiritual lesson associated with that. So let's understand what the spiritual lesson is. The minute you say in Judaism anything that has to do with eating, so besides the fact that the community will immediately become interested because anything to do with eating attracts our attention, but besides that, anytime that you talk about any rule or law or principle that has to do with eating, we default back to this position. Whatever you eat becomes part of who you are, because your body breaks the food down and then it extracts the nutrients out of that food, which becomes part of your fat cells and part of your bloodstream. So what you eat actually becomes part of who you are. That's why we're not allowed to eat non-kosher food, because there are certain traits and attributes that are associated with those non-kosher foods that we don't want to absorb into our system. For example, certain trait creatures are scavengers, so we don't want to have those traits. Some are predators, so we don't want to have those traits, and so on and so forth. Now, when a person eats, let's say now we're talking in the kosher realm, so a person is eating kosher meat. When a person eats kosher meat, so the concern is always that meat comes from an animal which is a lower, a less developed life form. So there's always the concern that maybe what's going to happen is it will have an influence over me because I eat it, because it becomes part of me. And in spite of it being kosher, I could also become associated with a lower kind of lifestyle. More impulsive, more materialistic. And for that reason, there's a whole process as to how we eat. We prepare the food in a very specific way. We are supposed to say a bracha before we eat the food. We're also then supposed to eat the food with a particular intention, that I'm going to use this energy and nutrition in order to be able to serve Hashem better. So there's a whole spiritual alignment that is supposed to accompany our experience of eating. When you eat food, usually it takes a bit of time for the body to break the food down until such time as the food becomes part of us. So when a person eats meat, we'll use the example of meat because we're making a comparison to blood. So when a person eats meat, there are two factors. Number one, the meat is the flesh, it's the body of the animal. So although, of course, it represents what the animal is, it certainly doesn't represent the energy of the animal. Number two, when you eat meat, it takes time for the body to break it down. So there's a period of time until it's absorbed into your system. So you've got kind of a little bit more time to work with the spiritual alignment that's supposed to accompany the food. Blood is different. Blood, the Torah tells us, nefesh habosar bedamhi. The soul of the animal is in its blood. So when you eat blood, you're not just eating the flesh of the animal, but you're actually eating the character of the animal, the life force of the animal. That means that the animalistic element is much more found in the blood than it is found in the meat, for obvious reasons. The meat is just, so to speak, what makes up the body that contains the animal. The blood carries the soul that is the animal. So because our approach to eating is that we want to avoid swallowing, absorbing the animalism of the animal, so that's why only certain animals are kosher. In order for an animal to be kosher, it has to be prepared in a very specific way. And we don't want the blood because we don't want the soul, the essence, the koch of that animal coming into our system. Secondly, blood is easier to digest than meat. It takes less time for it to be absorbed into the system. And so for that reason, there's a double issue with blood. You get more of the animal and it affects you more quickly than if you were eating the meat. That's the spiritual symbolism of eating blood. So in other words, what this represents for us is that whether it's about what you eat or not, every one of us during the course of our lives, it's just the natural experience of being human, we will over the course of our lives absorb certain animal-like traits. It's going to happen. It's part of being a citizen of physical planet Earth. It's what happens when you are in a materialistic environment. It's going to happen. We're going to have things about us that are animal-like. The question is, what do you do with it? The question is, how do you fix it? Let's say that a person has absorbed things into their life. I don't know, many years down the line that a person has either eaten what they shouldn't have eaten, or they've opened themselves to thinking or behavior which wasn't necessarily the way the Torah wants it. Now you're down the line, years down the line. What do you do about it? How do you fix it? Says the Torah, chazak. You have to be strong. Because it's the easiest thing in the world for a person to turn around and say, this is me. This is how I roll. This is who I am. You can't expect me to change now, or as some people will tell you, to teach an old dog new tricks. It's too far down the line. Comes along the Torah and says, chazak. You have the capacity and the potential and the promise that you can be strong. You can actually turn yourself, fix yourself, elevate yourself, revolutionize yourself at any point of time in your life. The question is just how. How does a person extricate themselves from decades worth of investment in materialism that actually starts to become our reality? How do you change? How do you become more sensitive? How do you become more transcendent? How do you become more spiritually oriented? There are two opinions, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon ben Azai. Rabbi Yehuda says that the way that you deal with this is you read everything at face value. Devarim kichsavan. You read what the Torah says, you take it literally, you don't ask too many questions, and you just adopt that lifestyle unquestioningly. That's how you fix yourself. That's how you elevate yourself. That's how you transform yourself. It's through a process that we call Kabbalas Oil, the acceptance of Hashem's authority without question. This is interestingly reflected in his name, because the name Rabbi Yehuda, the name Yehuda, originates from the phrase of our matriarch Leah when she named her fourth son Yehuda. She said, "Hapa'am oide es Hashem." This time I will submit myself in gratitude to Hashem, because that's what Yehuda means, to accept Hashem's authority and to accept that you have to show gratitude and thanks to Hashem for what you have, and therefore you do what Hashem says without question, with blinkers. You don't look left or right. You don't ask any questions. You don't have any challenge. You don't have any doubts. You do exactly what Hashem wants. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai had a different approach. For those people who are familiar, Rabbi Shimon ben Azai was a man who said, he was criticized by his colleagues for not marrying. He said, what do you want from me? I love the Torah so much. I'm so enthusiastic about the Torah. I don't have time for marriage. So Rabbi Shimon ben Azai's approach is that you become so absorbed and so enthusiastic. That's why he reads the word chazak to mean be absolutely invested, absolutely careful, absolutely involved in the fulfillment of mitzvahs. Because his approach is, how does a person combat the tendency to materialism? By creating so much excitement and so much enthusiasm and so much energy for what you should be doing that you no longer have time for what you should not be doing. They say that the Rebbe used to say he wants his Hasidim to be so busy that they don't have time to sin. So Rabbi Shimon ben Azai's approach is, if you want to deal with the blood, with the koch, with the enthusiasm for material things, the only way to counterbalance it is to generate a tremendous enthusiasm for spiritual and holy things, and that will help a person to drag themselves out of the mud. So we have two possible approaches, each of which we could apply in our lives. The one is to accept what the Torah says without question, Rabbi Yehuda's approach. The other is to become absolutely energized and enthusiastic to do what Hashem wants, Rabbi Shimon ben Azai's approach. And a combination of the two is the most healthy way to ensure that we don't get sucked down into materialism, but that we're able to preserve the integrity of and the value of our neshama.